The curious chain of events which brought General Friedrich Paulus to command the Sixth Army began with Hitler's angry disappointment towards the end of 1941, and a year later, a very similar frustration would lead to the disaster which befell Paulus and his divisions. In November 1941, while the world's attention was focused on the approaches to Moscow, the situation in the eastern Ukraine had fluctuated wildly. At the climax of Army Group South's advance, the leading divisions of Kleist's 1st Panzer Group reached Rostov-on-Don on 19 November in driving snow. The following day, they seized the bridge over the Great River, the last barrier before the Caucasus. But the Soviet commander, Timoshenko, reacted quickly. The left flank of the German spearhead was weakly guarded by Hungarian troops, and a thrust there, combined with counterattacks across the frozen Don, soon forced Kleist back. Hitler was furious, having just exulted in the illusion that both Moscow and the Caucasian oil fields lay within his grasp. To make matters worse, this was the first withdrawal by the German army during the Second World War. He refused to believe that Field Marshal von Rundstedt lacked the strength and the supplies, and he refused to accept that Kleist should be permitted to pull back his troops, many of them badly frostbitten, to the line of the river Mius. Rundstedt indicated on 30 November that if confidence no longer existed in his leadership, then he wished to be relieved of his command. Early the next morning, Hitler dismissed him. He ordered Reichenau, the commander of the Sixth Army, to take over and halt the withdrawal immediately. This Reichenau attempted or pretended to do. A few hours later, a shamelessly short time, he sent a message to Führer headquarters with the information that withdrawal behind the Mius had become inevitable. Reichenau, an overactive bulldog of a man whose apoplectic expression was heightened by his monocle, did not endear himself to Rundstedt, who later described him as a roughneck who used to run around half naked when taking physical exercise. On December 3rd, the Führer flew down to the Ukraine in his Focke-Wulf Condor to find out what had happened. He first spoke to Sepp Dietrich, the commander of the SS Leibstandarte Division. Dietrich, to Hitler's astonishment, supported Rundstedt's decision to withdraw. Both Rundstedt and Reichenau had their headquarters at Poltava, where Charles XII of Sweden, the first modern invader of Russia, had been defeated by Peter the Great in 1709. The Führer made his peace with Rundstedt, who had not yet departed. It was agreed that the old field marshal should still return home, although now it would be for sick leave. 9 days later, he received a check for 250,000 RM from the Führer as a birthday present. Hitler, still slightly suspicious of Reichenau, at first insisted that he remain commander-in-chief of the Sixth Army as well as of Army Group South. But over dinner, while the Führer carefully chewed his millet and pumpkin and potato puffs, Reichenau argued convincingly that he could not run two headquarters at once. He recommended that General Paulus, his former chief of staff, should take over the Sixth Army. Hitler assented, although without much enthusiasm. Thus, on New Year's Day, 1942, Paulus, who had never even commanded a division or corps, found himself catapulted up the army list to the rank of General of Panzer Troops. 5 days later, he became commander-in-chief. Although Paulus's rather aloof manner made him appear cold, he was more sensitive than many generals to the well-being of his soldiers. He is also said to have cancelled Reichenau's order of October 10, 1941, encouraging the severe treatment of Jews and partisans. Yet, when the Sixth Army reached Stalingrad, its Feldgendarmerie was apparently given the task of arresting communist activists and Jews to hand them over to the SD Sonderkommando for punitive measures. Paulus certainly inherited a heavy legacy. From the very start of Barbarossa, the massacres of Jews and Gypsies had been deliberately mixed in, whenever possible, with the execution of partisans, mainly because the phrase Jüdische Saboteure helped to cloud the illegality of the act and to bolster the notion of a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. The definition of partisan and saboteur was soon widened far beyond the terms of international law, which permitted a death sentence only after a proper trial. In an order of 10 July 1941, 6th Army Headquarters warned soldiers that anyone in civilian clothes with a close-cropped head was almost certain to be a Red Army soldier and should therefore be shot. Civilians who behaved in a hostile fashion, including those who gave food to Red Army soldiers hiding in woods, were also to be shot. Dangerous elements, such as Soviet officials, a category which extended from the local Communist Party secretary and collective farm manager to almost anyone employed by the government, should, like commissars and Jews, be handed over to the SD Sonderkommando. A subsequent order called for collective measures, either executions or the burning of villages, to punish sabotage. According to the evidence of SS Obersturmführer August Hafner, Field Marshal von Reichenau himself gave the order early in July 1941 for 3,000 Jews to be shot as a reprisal measure. The behavior of many soldiers in Army Group South was particularly gruesome. Reichenau's 6th Army Headquarters issued the following order on 10 August 19. Grosskurth wrote a full report which he sent direct to Headquarters, Army Group South. Appalled and furious, he wrote to his wife, "We cannot and should not be allowed to win this war." At the first opportunity, he went on leave to Paris to see Field Marshal von Witzleben, one of the leading members in the anti-Hitler movement. The massacre of the innocents in Belaya Tserkov was soon dwarfed by a far greater atrocity. Following the capture of Kiev, 33,771 Jews were rounded up in the last days of September to be slaughtered by Sonderkommando 4A and 2 police battalions in the ravine of Babi Yar outside the city. This Gross Aktion was once again entirely within the 6th Army's area of responsibility. Reichenau, along with certain key officers from his headquarters who attended the town commandant's planning conference on 27 September 1941, must have known their fate in advance, even if the soldiers detailed to assist in the roundup may have been taken in by the cover story of evacuation. Soviet Jews did not imagine what awaited them. They had little idea of Nazi anti-Semitism because under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, no criticism of National Socialist policies had been published. The town commandant, in his proclamation posters, had also lulled suspicions with the instruction, "You should bring with you identity papers, money, and valuables, as well as warm clothing." The Sonderkommando, which had expected 5,000 to 6,000 Jews, was astonished to find that more than 30,000 had turned up. Field Marshal von Reichenau's notorious order to the 6th Army of 10 October 1941, which was supported by Field Marshal von Rundstedt, quite clearly makes the Wehrmacht chain of command jointly responsible for atrocities against Jews and civilians in the Ukraine. In this eastern theater of war, the soldier is not only a man fighting according to the rules of war, but also the ruthless standard-bearer of a national ideal and the avenger of all the bestialities perpetrated on the German peoples. For this reason, the soldier must fully appreciate the necessity for the severe but just retribution that must be meted out to the subhuman species of Jewry. Their duty was to free the German people forever from the Jewish Asiatic threat. Reprisal burnings and executions did not end with Reichenau's death and Paulus's arrival. For example, on 29 January 1942, some 3 weeks after the new commander-in-chief of 6th Army took over, the village of Komsomolsk near Kharkov, with 150 houses, was burned to the ground. During this operation, 8 people were shot, and 2 children, presumably so terrified that they stayed hidden, were burned to death. German soldiers were bound to mistreat civilians after nearly 9 years of the regime's anti-Slav and anti-Semitic propaganda, even if few of them consciously acted at the time out of Nazi values. The nature of the war produced emotions that were both primitive and complex. Although there were cases of soldiers reluctant to carry out executions when ordered, most natural pity for civilians was transmuted into an incoherent anger based on the feeling that women and children, contrary to all rules of war, surrender did not guarantee the lives of Red Army soldiers. On the 3rd day of the invasion of the Ukraine, August von Kaganek, a reconnaissance troop commander with 9th Panzer Division, saw from the turret of his reconnaissance vehicle dead men lying in a neat row under the trees alongside a country lane, all in the same position, face down. They had clearly not been killed in combat. Nazi propaganda, simultaneously provoking both atavistic fears and hate, incited soldiers to kill as much out of the former as the latter. Yet at the same time, it also reminded them that they were brave German soldiers. This produced a powerfully destructive combination, for it is the attempt to control the outward signs of cowardice which produces the most violent reaction of all. The greatest fear that Nazi propaganda encouraged among troops was a fear of capture. "We were afraid," Kaganek acknowledged, "afraid of falling into the hands of the Russians, no doubt thirsty for revenge after our surprise attack." Officers with traditional values were even more appalled when they heard of soldiers taking potshots at the columns of Soviet prisoners trudging to the rear. These endless columns of defeated men, hungry and above all thirsty in the summer heat, their brown uniforms and fore and aft pilotka caps covered in dust, were seen as little better than herds of animals. An Italian journalist who had seen many columns wrote, "Most of them are wounded. They wear no bandages, their faces are caked with blood and dust, their uniforms are in rags, their hands blackened. They walk slowly, supporting one another." The wounded generally received no medical assistance, and those who could not march or who collapsed from exhaustion were shot. Soviet soldiers were not allowed to be transported in German military transport in case they infected it with lice and fleas. It should not be forgotten that 600 Soviet prisoners of war were gassed in Auschwitz on 3 September 1941. This was the first experiment there with Zyklon B. For those who reached prisoner of war camps alive, the chance of survival turned out to be not much better than 1 in 3. Altogether, over 3 million Red Army soldiers out of 5.7 million died in German camps from disease, exposure, starvation, and ill treatment. The German army itself, not the SS nor any other Nazi organization, was responsible for prisoners of war. Its attitude was reminiscent of Kaiser Wilhelm II's remark in 1914 that the 90,000 Russian prisoners captured at Tannenberg should be left to starve. On the southern front, a German camp at Lozovaya, overrun by Timoshenko's January advance, revealed appalling conditions, with Red Army prisoners dying of cold, of starvation, of brutal maltreatment. Yuri Mikhailovich Maximon of the 127th Rifle Division, captured in the autumn of 1941, was one of those taken to Novo-Alexandrovsk. The so-called camp there had no huts, just open ground with a barbed wire fence. The 18,000 men were fed from 12 cauldrons, in which odd hunks of horseflesh were boiled. When the guards on duty gave the order to come forward to receive food, submachine gunners shot down anybody who ran. Their corpses were left there for 3 days as a warning. German officers at the front wanted prisoners to be better treated for practical reasons. Their information on enemy numbers, organization, and intentions may give us more than our own intelligence services can provide, read an instruction from the Chief Intelligence Officer of the 96th Infantry Division. Russian soldiers, he added, respond to interrogation in a night. Paulus moved 6th Army headquarters forward to Kharkov, Marshal Timoshenko's objective. The temperature had dropped to 30 degrees below zero, sometimes lower. German transport by rail and road was frozen solid, and horse-drawn carts could provide only the barest rations. Timoshenko's plan had been to cut off the industrial region of the Donbass and seize Kharkov in a huge encirclement, but only the southern part of the pincer had managed to pierce the German lines. This had been a successful thrust, taking a salient nearly 60 miles deep, but the Red Army lacked the resources and fresh troops, and after 2 months of bitter fighting, their attacks ground to a halt. The 6th Army held on, yet Paulus was uneasy. Field Marshal von Bock, whom Hitler had reluctantly appointed to command Army Group South, did not disguise his feeling that he had been overcautious in counterattacking. Paulus kept his command with the support of his protector, General Hyder. His chief of staff, Colonel Ferdinand Heim, was moved instead. In his place came Colonel Arthur Schmidt, a slim, sharp-featured and sharp-tongued staff officer from a Hamburg mercantile family. Schmidt, confident of his own abilities, put up many backs within 6th Army headquarters, although he also had his supporters. Paulus relied greatly on his judgment, and as a result he played a large, some say an excessive, role in determining the course of events later that year. In the early spring of 1942, the divisions that were to perish at Stalingrad took little interest in staff gossip. Their immediate concerns were replenishment and rearmament. It said much for the professional resilience of the German army, and much less for its sense of self-preservation, that memories of the terrible winter were virtually effaced as soon as spring and new equipment arrived. Morale was higher again, remembered one commander, whose company at last had a full complement of 18 tanks. We were in a good state. They were not even greatly disturbed by the fact that even the long-barreled version of the Panzer Mark III had only a 50mm gun, whose shell often failed to penetrate Soviet tanks. Although no announcement had been made within divisions, everyone knew that a major offensive would not be long in coming. In March, General Pfeffer, the commander of the 297th Infantry Division, said half-jokingly to a captain who was reluctant to be sent back to France for a battalion commander's course, "Just be happy that you're getting a break. The war will last long enough and be terrible enough for you to get a good taste of it." In March, General Hyder drove to Rastenburg to present the plans. On 10th May, Paulus submitted to Field Marshal von Bock his draft plans for Operation Fredericus, the elimination of the Barvenkovo salient gained by Timoshenko during the January offensive. Bock's fears of a Russian attack proved correct even sooner than he had feared. Timoshenko had assembled 640,000 men, 1,200 tanks, and nearly 1,000 aircraft. On 12th May, 6 days before the scheduled start of Operation Fredericus, the Red Army launched twin attacks from around Volchansk and from the Barvenkovo salient to cut off Kharkov. Bock warned Paulus not to counterattack too hurriedly or without air support, but Soviet tank brigades broke through the front of General Walther Heitz's 8th Corps, and by that evening, Russian tank units were a dozen miles from Kharkov. Next morning, Bock realized that the enemy breakthrough round Volchansk was more serious than he had realized. Paulus's 6th Army received a heavy battering from different directions. In 72 hours of fighting, much of it in heavy rain, 16 battalions were destroyed. Paulus was convinced that a holding action, giving ground where necessary, was the only solution. Bach, however, had other ideas. He persuaded Haider to convince Hitler that a bold counterattack with Kleisk's 1st Panzer Army could transform a setback into victory. The Führer, who lived for such moments, immediately recognized the opportunity. Claiming the idea for his own, he galvanized Kleist into moving his 1st Panzer Army rapidly into position to strike at the enemy's southern flank. He ordered the Luftwaffe to concentrate every available attack group to pin down Timoshenko's formations until Kleist was ready. Kleist struck at the southern side of the Barvenkovo salient before dawn on 17th May. By midday, his spearhead had advanced 10 miles, even though his panzer divisions had to engage the T-34 at close range. Otherwise, their shells bounced off like fireworks. That evening, Timoshenko signaled Moscow, pleading for reinforcements to stop Kleist. According to Zhukov, Timoshenko did not warn Moscow that his armies were likely to be encircled, but the chief commissar of the front, Nikita Khrushchev, claimed that Stalin persistently refused to allow them to withdraw from danger. This later formed one of his indictments of Stalin during his famous denunciation in 1956 at the XX Party Congress. Finally, on 19th May, Timoshenko called off the offensive with Stalin's agreement, but it was too late. Bach decided that the moment had come for Paulus to attack from the north to seal the trap. The fighting which resulted, a gradual compression of over 250,000 Soviet troops, led to unusual situations. According to a senior NCO in the 389th Infantry Division, his Grenadier Regiment found itself in a merciless battle with what he described as a bandit battalion of women soldiers, commanded by a redhead. The fighting methods of these female beasts showed itself in treacherous and dangerous ways. They lie concealed in heaps of straw and shoot us in the back when we pass by. Just as the ring was closing, part of the 2nd Panzer Regiment and some mechanized artillery found themselves cut off at nightfall within the massed Russians. Their commander was the legendary Hyacinth Graf von Strotwitz, known as the Panzer Kavallerist. The 49-year-old Strotwitz, a renowned cavalryman in the First World War, his troop had been so far to the front in the advance of 1914 that they had seen Paris in the distance, still retained the dark mustache and the dashing good looks of a 1920s film star. More important, he had not lost the uncanny nose for danger which had made his reputation as a lucky commander.